the 1990s. Street Fighter 2 was in the arcades, blowing people's minds. In fact, the arcades were a thing, full stop. People were wearing, okay, so we won't mention the clothes, but we will talk about what they were driving. You see, I think there's a justification to state that the 90s were in fact the best decade for new cars ever. There are many great cars over the years. It's often said that the 1960s represents the decade with the most beautiful machinery, and it's hard to argue against that. Obvious examples of this include the infamous Ferrari 250 GTO, the mid-engine 250 LM, the Jaguar E-Type, and a personal favourite of mine, the Alfa Romeo Tipo 33 Stradale. There is something about the 90s though. Allow me to explain. Cars had by this point been in existence for around 100 years, and they've come a long way in that time. Cars were becoming much more reliable, rust prevention was getting better, build quality overall was improved, ABS was being introduced in more and more cars, and you could even find airbags. As such, they were becoming safer. They were, by and large, usable, and reliably so, daily in fact. But at the same time, they were still largely analogue in nature, with manual gearboxes, cable accelerators, either hydraulic steering or even no power assistance at all, and some were even still carburettor fed. Many of the pitfalls of motoring had been engineered out, but they were still simplistic, with less electronic and technological interference than much of what's followed, and they had usable power and performance figures. 0 to 60 really mattered back then. Nowadays, cars have grown so much, not just in terms of size and weight, but power figures too, that 0 to 60 times are almost irrelevant. In the 90s, sub 10 seconds to 60 could be a fun drive. Nowadays, we have road cars doing a full quarter mile in that time. It's not so much that it's out of hand, it's just that it's unusable on the public roads, particularly here in the UK. So, let's take a look at some examples of why I believe the 90s to be the best decade in the history of cars for enthusiasts of driving so far. Take perhaps the greatest name in the automotive world, Ferrari. In the 90s, we saw the introduction of the 355, a car that, despite stories of frequent engine out cam belt changes, brought usability and a degree of reliability to the table for the great Italian marque. Whilst at the same time, 5 valves per cylinder brought an 8,500 RPM redline and possibly the most glorious howling V8 soundtrack ever. It's one of the last hand-built Ferraris, but it was also the first to really embrace modern technology. With 375 horsepower, it was usable performance too. Nowadays, a sports saloon has more power, and the modern equivalent of a V8 mid-engine Ferrari, the F8 Tributo, has nearly double at 710 brake horsepower. When you look at BMW in the 90s, the advertising campaign was clear. The ultimate driving machine. Remember those adverts? The aspiration was pitched at driving. The E34 generation M5 had 315 brake horsepower and weighed 1,650 kilos. Today, many hot hatches have more power, and the current M5 has over 600 bhp and weighs over 1,900 kilos. This isn't to say that less horsepower equals more fun. It's just a realisation that on the public roads, the performance cars from the 90s were wonderfully usable. You could wring their necks, and what's more fun than that? A look at the 90s cannot be without mention of perhaps the greatest single road car in the history of the automobile, the Mclaren F1. Launched in 1992, it may well have failed on its initial sales targets, but as the years have passed, this adds to its allure and has pushed current values to simply unbelievable figures. After expressing that less performance can actually lead to more fun on the public roads, I'm all too aware that the Mclaren F1 flies in the face of this. 627 brake horsepower in a car weighing 1100 kilos made for shocking acceleration figures at the time, and its record-breaking 240 mph top speed held the production car record for the best part of 15 years. The Mclaren F1 is the complete package, the ultimate driver's car.
391, 391.
It's the uncompromising design, the complete lack of technological interference, its raw and completely pure driving experience that sets this car apart. Its clean, uncluttered design remains beautiful to this day, and yet, when they applied an aero package to the car, it was able not only to compete in sports car racing, but it won the 1995 24 Hour of Le Mans outright against a field that included purpose-built prototypes. The Mclaren F1 will forever remain as one of the most spectacular and special automotive creations in history. We cannot forget either the golden era of hot hatchbacks, a genre that really got into its stride a decade earlier in the 1980s, with greats such as the Peugeot 205 GTI and the Mark II Golf GTI, and the Renault 5 GT Turbo. These iconic hatches may have all begun in the 80s, but carried on into the early 90s. Once again, these cars were usable with accessible levels of performance you could fully extract on a local back road. They offered pure driving experiences and cut right into popular culture, becoming icons of their time. We began the decade with the Peugeot 205 and ended it with the likes of the 306 GTI 6. The 306 still offered plenty of fun and excitement, but the car had grown up and offered the kind of everyday usability we now take for granted. The 90s also saw the VW Golf grow all the way up into the Mark IV, a car that hasn't perhaps gone down as the best in terms of driving thrills, but the Mark IV pushed build quality and refinement in the sector like no other. It brought about a build quality that stands up even today. And finally, to wrap up my proposition that the 90s are in fact the pinnacle for new cars, is the legendary era of JDM magic. Growing up, I genuinely believed Toyota to be a sports car manufacturer. In the 90s, Toyota's model range included a mid-engine sports car with junior Ferrari looks, in the form of the Mark II SW20 MR2, a swoopy GT car in the form of the Celica, and the legendary Mark IV Supra, which, equipped with the turbo 2JZ engine, went on to become an absolute JDM icon. The 280 brake horsepower gentleman's agreement in Japan actually made for a wonderfully varied plethora of sports and performance cars. Looking back, having that engine power cap meant that manufacturers looked at different ways to set their cars apart. Take Honda's NSX, which launched in 1990. It was revolutionary in bringing usability and reliability to sports cars. It was the first car to bring all aluminium construction to a production car, and its clean lines and pure design mean it still looks good today. As a channel, we've got first-hand experience of just how wonderful that high-revving VTEC V6 can sound. Let's also not forget the rally rivalry of Subaru and Mitsubishi with the Evo and the Impreza. The Evos were pretty dominant in the WRC, particularly with Tommy Mclaren at the wheel, but I'll always be in awe of Colin McRae behind the wheel of L55 Bat in his championship-winning 1995 season and that classic Subaru soundtrack. Lastly, we turn to Nissan and the phenomenal GTR machines. The R33 GTR actually launched in 1989 and was created to dominate Group A racing. With its motorsport-derived all-wheel drive system and RB26 twin turbocharged engine, and dominate it did, in the then Australian Touring Car Championships and the Japanese Touring Car Championships, until 1994, when the rules changed from Group A to Super Touring regulations. It then followed with the R33 GTR, which set a production car record of a sub 8-minute lap time of the Nürburgring. I could go on and tell numerous stories of all the cars from the 90s, but maybe we'll dig into some of those models in greater detail in future videos. The key points here are that cars really were moving on and introducing real reliability and engineering advancements, whilst at the same time offering true analogue driving experiences that you could truly exploit on the public roads. We started the 90s with cars that could be found without any electronics at all, perhaps without even such things as power steering or ABS, and finished it with cars that had modern variable valve timing, sophisticated drivetrains and long-lasting build quality. Yes, the interiors look and feel cheap, but for the most part, they're pretty hard wearing, and this channel's focus is on the driving, the connection between the driver and the machine. The 90s then are the decade that contained one of the greatest road cars ever in the form of the Mclaren F1, but they also contained a great number of more ordinary and accessible cars that also aim to provide driver satisfaction. There might be objectively better cars built in the years since, with greater performance levels and technological advancements, but all things considered, the 90s offered true driving experiences and more than enough performance for the public roads. They just might be the best decade for enthusiasts of driving in the history of the automobile. Let us know how you feel in the comment section down below. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you next time.